Welcome to the Comfortable in Chaos Podcast. Strangle your demons and let's go.
Y'all need Jesus!
Flip on the telly, wrestle with Jimmy. Something is a-bubbling behind my back. The bottle is ready to blow. Say it ain't so. Your drug is a heartbreaker. Welcome to the Comfortable in Chaos Podcast. I am your host, Eric Hellberg, and you know we're like Einstein over here, man. We have no special talents. We're just passionately curious about all things pertaining to men. How in the hell did we get here, and where is it that we want to go? Guys, I've been doing some thinking. Where are we at here? June, July, August, September. Guys, the election's in 5 months. We are going to chart out a new course for this nation. Either death and destruction or the possibility to repair and continue. I believe the choice is obvious. I so pray that you see it that way as well. But maybe we have framed President Papa Joe Biden in a bad light. Shouldn't we give him a chance? I mean, he has actually accomplished an awful lot in this first term. And we want to keep him actually one term. But think about it. That man has done more for Ukraine and the migrants of the world than any other American president. I mean, that's something, isn't it? He hadn't done shit for us. But if you live in Ukraine, and actually, it's not even the people of Ukraine. They're cannon fodder. Most of them have left. They're trying to fill the vacuum in this war of attrition, and they will all be decimated. And yeah, F you too, Macron. We know your soldiers have been on the ground since 2022, and you're threatening to send more? You only have 7,300 combat-ready forces. Putin will kill them in a day, you ignoramus. Go ahead and send them. We don't give a flying. But yeah, President Biden has done more for the oligarchs and the Americans who benefit off of that war than any other president. And if you're not from here, it doesn't matter if you're Chinese, Muslim, Honduran, Nicaraguan, Mexicano, he's done a lot for you too. He just hasn't done one flipping thing for the American people. Let that sink in, people. So maybe we ought to frame Joe in a better light. I mean, he's been a good one-term president for some peoples, just not our peoples. And on the Trump side, man, I know the liberals are upset with Trump, and I just can't understand why, because you would think that President Trump had stolen, let's say, 90% of the Haitian relief funds after that earthquake. He didn't do that, did he? You would think maybe President Trump had sold 20% of our uranium to Russia, and despite even being in a war with them, we're still buying it back. You would think that President Trump deleted 33,000 emails on his own private server. You would think that President Trump may have sat with a predator feed overhead and let innocent Americans die in Benghazi. So I understand why the liberals are upset with President Trump. The crazy thing about those emails that all mysteriously vanished and nothing ever happened from Hillary is that they foretold exactly, because you do have to have some method of record keeping. I mean, how do you reach back out to the people who have provided you favor, right? If Russia does a favor for the Clintons, well, we got to keep a record of that so Bill can then show up in Moscow and get paid $500,000 for that speech. And how are we going to know that the Clinton Foundation received more money from any country in the world except from Ukraine from 1999 through the revolution in 2014. Maybe those emails actually detail Joe Biden's interest in Ukraine, the Biden family. Maybe it actually details why people like Senator Kerry and Nancy Pelosi's son, and yes, the Republican rhino Mitt Romney's son, all were appointed to high-paying positions within Ukrainian oil and gas boards. We've done an episode called Pedophile Joe. Maybe it also details the child trafficking that we know that Billy Bob and Hillary had a penchant for. And we are not going to forget our Epstein's list. Maybe this is all one large conglomeration that comes to a head in Ukraine. So maybe that's why all the emails had to go away. What is it that we're really protecting in Ukraine? What is it that we do not want the people to actually know in Ukraine? And here is what I'm going to go into today, guys. This is what I have been leading up to. We've done the paradox issues of this week. We said we are going to rewire our brains. Because if you are God-fearing men and you believe that the ways of this world is false, then you should also be able to grasp. It is going to be very difficult because we have been indoctrinated since our memory started to persist from childhood. To think a certain way, to believe a certain way, and to act a certain way. I'm not going to even get into whether it was godly or not, because it's not. But if the devil is the father of all lies, and if you believe that we are living in a counterfeit culture, then it is absolutely imperative that you start to look upon all this on your own, put the pieces together of this jigsaw so you can actually see what is directly in front of you. Should you be willing to, remember I did an episode when I first started this show called Are You Willing to Sacrifice? And really what that episode detailed is that I don't care how effing courageous you pose and pretend to be. Most people are not willing to sacrifice, meaning really lose in this world. They are not willing to lose popular opinion about themselves, nor are they willing to lose with their pocketbooks. And I told you how it was probably considered worldly mistakes, but how I stood up against some very powerful interests, and I lost. So to stand up for what is right, you will have to lose in this world. And that is why no man, I don't give up if he's in the church, I don't care if he's in corporate America, certainly in the government, they just aren't willing to do so. And the reason they are not willing to do so, we don't have to say were they given over to depraved minds as detailed in the Bible, but we have to run counterculture in a culture that wants to take us to imminent death. And it actually originated after the end of World War II from our very own Central Intelligence Agency. It was detailed in a project called Operation Mockingbird. What was that? It's known about now, but what it isn't known about that program is how comprehensive in nature it was. Basically, the CIA recruited media at that time to disseminate their messaging. They had journalists on their payroll, broadcasters on their payroll, and from that point forward, they decided they were going to shape the American persona, the way we think, limit our ability to think, and what would happen if you went against it? Well, you would be persecuted. They also did studies in conjunction with the Department of Justice, and you don't have to believe me, I'm just a nobody. You can believe Candace Owens, right? She has an enormously popular show, and rightly so. She's fantastic. And I champion her because she is actually talking about more of the outline information than the mainstream pundits who we now say are giving us the real news, a.k.a. Sean Hannity or Fox and Friends. It's the biggest crock of shit ever. They're also regurgitating stories, no intellectual capacity and no intellectual honesty. They will always go so far, and then if you were in front of them, they will lie to you to craft that opinion. They don't want to lose their position, and they don't want to lose what it is that they have. But Candace detailed it, actually. There were experiments done in the 60s. There were experiments done in the 70s. They wanted to know if they had maintained their control and or grip upon your psyche. They continued until the 80s. You know what they would do? They would get a group of 15 to 20 people. They would call it a controlled study, and they would advertise for it under a different name. And people would come in, just like a medical study, say an asthma or a sleep study, and they pay you for your time. Well, what the one actual unknowing participant would not know, meaning they would actually only bring in one person. The rest would be either contracted agents or direct line employees of said governmental agencies. And for example, they would disseminate a sheet of paper, let's say to all 20 people. And on that paper would be a circle, just a simple circle drawn. And they would have everyone together, and they would say, what is it that you would see? And they would start in whatever order they established, and one person would look at that circle, and he'd say, I see a triangle. And they'd go right on down the line. Now they're really seeing a circle, but they say, I see a triangle. And the only honest and unknowing participant is looking around, what the hell? I see a circle. Why are they doing that? What are they saying? What? I don't get it. One by one, what do you see? I see a triangle. Well, you get to the end of line. Unknowing contestant number 20. They're like, well, sir, ma'am, what is it that you see on your paper? What in the F do you think they're going to say? They don't want to be crazy. I see a triangle. So do you see how all this works, men? Is it computing yet? Do you get it at all? I mean, the only way to honestly get ahead in today's day and age, I guess you have to become a member of government, right? How does someone like an AOC Cortez, up until 2019, when she becomes a United States House of Representatives member, whereas before she was a bartender, the original, I'm the Jenny on the block. Yeah, the Bronx, Brooklyn, wherever the hell, it doesn't matter. But she was $8,000 in debt, according to her campaign filings. It is now estimated that AOC is worth between $19 and $29 million. How do we get a gig like that, guys? You have to be willing to do the deal. And when you know that something is coming down the pipe, you can definitely become a shareholder in that company. If you know policy is going to affect something deleteriously, well, you can certainly get rid of that holding. It is how the game is played. That's why Nancy Pelosi is a billionaire. But it's all in Paul and his different offshore companies' names, right? That is how the game is played. And going back to Project Mockingbird, let's go back to what happened in the Third Reich, because history always repeats itself. We're just ignorant of it. That's why we are constantly, as a nation, trying to erase our history. only focus on the present, and you will never have a perspective to draw from and make an appropriate decision. Well, what happened? His actual title was Director of Propaganda and Enlightenment. Director of Propaganda and Enlightenment? What the was he trying to enlighten us to? And who is it that I'm speaking of? None other than Joseph Goebbels, right? The father of the big lie during the Third Reich. And here is what he said. And here is the place we find ourselves because our leaders have no respect for us. And no man can ever rise above the disrespect that is afforded to him. It is very hard to do. And our government knows that if it keeps its people in a certain box, as you heard me in that episode, the man in the box, we will virtually entangle ourselves in the lies that they feed us and almost feel like it is inescapable despite the fact that we are purportedly free. So here's what Goebbels said. I want you to listen close to this. You've often only heard snippets, but you tell me if this isn't where we are at now. He said, if you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. The lie can be maintained only for such time as the state can shield the people from the political, economic, and/or military consequences of the lie. It thus becomes vitally important for the state to use all of its powers to repress, meaning stop dissent. You cannot think different. For the truth is the mortal enemy of the lie. And thus, by extension, the truth is the greatest enemy of the state. We are being led by liars and a demonic government that want to go unchallenged despite the fact they work for us, but they do not want us to know the truth. And so many of us are willing to accept those lies. I hope you are starting to feel different. I pray you are wanting to be different. What was it that Edward Snowden was actually guilty of? He was branded a traitor, wasn't he? He was on the run. He's now in Russia, the only place on earth that can actually protect him from American hands. Think about that. We can reach out and touch him anywhere else in the world except in Mother Russia. Isn't that something? And all Edward Snowden did, but you believe he is a catastrophic traitor and has somehow sold out the American people. All he did was when he noticed abnormalities, violations of real civil rights, our civil liberties, the fact that the American people who actually had their own opinion were rising up, expressing something different than the narrative that this government was telling to us. And then they were being targeted by our government. Maybe they would have a tax audit. Maybe their business would be somehow shut down. He exposed the NSA's, what would you call it? Spying scandal on the American people. And here's how he did it. He simply took what is our information, public information, projects that he was working on until he figured out they had become weaponized against us instead of foreign adversaries. He then went to our own American press, jeopardized himself, and he provided information to our American press. The same people that sit with Karine Jean-Pierre every day and she fields questions from. And they ran with the story. Ultimately, it was the New York Times. and for letting the American people know how they had become the actual opposition and the enemies of the government by which we support and put them in, he was branded a traitor. That is what Edward Snowden is guilty of, and the reason why he cannot come back here and ever step foot outside of a prison again. Okay, well, when you really look at the Third Reich and you really, really want to go deep and see how it is that we got here today, realize we would not have needed a Joseph Goebbels if there was not a mass campaign to marginalize, to disenfranchise, to step by step destroy a whole class and or ethnicity of people, meaning the Jews, God's chosen people, and ultimately to denigrate them to such a level whereby they were subhuman and or really have no reason to exist. Therefore, their destruction or killing ought to be accepted. And isn't that what happened in Nazi Germany? That is exactly what happened in Nazi Germany. Okay? Let's go deep. Let's go very, very deep. At the time of World War II, we founded the precursor to the CIA. It was called the Office of Strategic Services. It was headed up by a guy by the name of Bill Donovan. His nickname was Wild Bill Donovan. He had worked in and out of Germany. Germany was coming off of World War I, and we know that they were brutally defeated. The losses around the world were catastrophic. It was a war fought primarily in Europe. Okay, that is what it is. Sanctions. You hear about us placing sanctions on people to economically cripple them all the time. That is one of our tactics here in the U.S. Go our way, or we will no longer import your goods. We will place tariffs on the others. We have a whole arsenal that we employ. So Germany was going nowhere. Well, guess what? We weren't going anywhere either, because we had passed the Federal Reserve Act at Bretton Woods. We had established the Federal Reserve. A central bank was now controlling monetary policy. It was all done hush, hush, hush. And this all happened during that time. What did it immediately lead to? It led to the Great Depression approximately a decade later. People were struggling in America. They were barely getting by. And what is the very best way to get America out of a slump and or an economy spinning again than war? Why do you think we stay engaged in warfare all the time when we know that our economy sucks and nothing else works? We have created a system so the rich can get richer, those at the top benefit, and we stay in a perpetual state of war. We use those same big lies to demonize people, to justify the effort, and to get the American war footing going once again. That's why since our inception at 1776, you tell me one period of time up until present day, right here and now, whereby we have not been at war. For people who love freedom and purportedly love peace and purportedly want to be left alone, why don't we do it anywhere else in the world? Have you thought about that, men? So let's go into the Third Reich a little bit more. What was going to reestablish Germany as a preeminent nation in the world? Well, warfare. So World War II had to happen. And this may shock you. Wild Bill Donovan basically said, I'm going to do a psychological profile of Hitler. How could he do that? Because he knew Hitler. And he said Hitler's primary rules were never allow the public to cool off, meaning keep them in a stir. If you are their leaders and or government, never admit a fault or wrong. Never concede that there may be some good in your enemy. We know all people have a capacity for good. Never leave room for alternatives. Never accept blame. Concentrate on one enemy at a time. At that time, it was the Jews, right? And blame him for everything that goes wrong. We see this polarization in Democrat, Republican, Trump, Biden, whatever. People will believe a big lie sooner than a little one. And if you repeat it frequently enough, people will sooner or later believe it. And that is how the Third Reich applied the big lie. The Jews became bad. So now we have to go to war and therefore exterminate the Jews. But how did we go to war? If you have listened to my previous episodes called Bushmaster, I detail the Bush crime family. It ain't just a Biden crime family. And what you need to focus on is someone by the name of Averell Harriman. He was an investment banker, an industrialist, and he was the primary shareholder of the Union Bank and Trust encamped at New York City. One of his fellow board members was George Bush Sr.'s father, Prescott Bush. Oh, yeah. So that bank served as the primary conduit for the Nazi war machine, or really the beating drums leading up to war. That's how they could trade in American dollars. So there would be no Hitler had we not financed Hitler. And I'll tell you another thing. This is going to sound abhorrent to you. There was a particular type of gas that was used in the concentration camps. Think Buchenwald, Auschwitz. It was made by a company called IG Farben. Well, Averell Harriman sat on a couple of those boards in Germany, despite the fact that he was an American citizen. He knew all those German industrialists. They knew war was coming, and they knew war would pull them out of the dregs of their horrific economy. And you want me to tell you what IG Farben was? It was a conglomerate of 7 other companies, some of which you may in fact know. You know why? Because still to this day, despite that they are German-owned, they have huge offices right here in America. And let me go through a couple of the names you may know. Bayer, a Bayer aspirin, Bayer Chemicals. ThyssenKrupp, have you ever heard of those guys? BASF, the big German chemical company where we have their refineries here. Well, IG Farben is who manufactured all the noxious, lethal gas that exterminated the Jews. We provided that funding as well, man. So are you starting to tell me that we have never engaged into telling a big lie and demonizing someone so we can also hit the drums of war and then engage in it? Let me tell you this. Prior to World War II, going all the way back to the Roman Empire, because civilizations have been on this planet long before us, advanced countries and people. We're often likened to the modern day Roman Empire, and everything that we lament that went wrong in Rome, we're dealing with right here and now. Correct? Well, Rome considered the Hun. And who is it that we have referred to as the Hun? Why? The Germanic peoples, of course, right? Both in World War I and World War II. They were called the dastardly Hun. Let's kill them. What did Patton say in that wonderful speech? You've seen it in the movie with George C. Scott. He says, "You kill that Hun bastard." Well, that's because of the old history of Attila the Hun. They were known as a warring, savage, barbaric people with a propensity for warfare, all of which is true. But we were willing to arm them, finance them. We still drive their fancy Mercedes-Benz that used to make the engines for the tanks way back when. But we'll drive their luxury vehicles right here and now to this day and be so happy with ourselves. Okay. Well, once again, like I mentioned with Candace Owens, I'm a nobody. You don't have to trust me. But maybe you can trust Dwight Eisenhower, right? Old Ike, the Supreme Allied Commander, later went to be our president. The interstate highway system, that's Ike's doing because he had been a wartime president. He had been a wartime leader. He already knew what the F was happening, and he probably thought that World War III would happen. He probably thought that those weapons of mass destruction, which we may have gotten to first, certainly we deployed them first over the island of Japan. He knew that was coming, and he knew that there would be situations whereby large groups of people in America needed to move, and we knew that our strategic bomber forces and all of our planes needed somewhere to land immediately. And not just at an airport or an Air Force base, but the interstate highway system. It's also Ike who said, "No one in the world deserves more credit than Marshal Zhukov." It wasn't friggin' Patton. It wasn't friggin' Montgomery. They were drinking tea. It wasn't any of those guys. It was a Russian general, Marshal Zhukov, that he credited with decimating the German Hun. And yes, we had catastrophic losses in World War II. Several 100,000. The Russian people lost 25 to 30 million people in civilian populace. It may even be higher. And soldiers killed. No one undertook more to defeat the German Hun, the barbaric savages, than Russia. And Dwight D. Eisenhower said that humanity owes Russia and Zhukov a great, huge thank you. Eisenhower had a personal relationship with Zhukov. Was that considered bad? He thought it was smart. He thought it was strategic. He actually got along famously with Stalin. But he knew the people that were waiting in the political wings, and he knew the warmongers would not let a nation without war go for long. And that's why you've heard me talk about it millions of times, that when he was leaving the office of presidency, he no longer had any control. That deep state that you have become akin to was already moving and shaking, and they were not going to allow a peaceful transition. Therefore, a new enemy had to be created. Truman abhorred the Russians, although he knew nothing of them. He had never dealt with them. So what did we have? We knew we had a formidable now adversary, whereas days before they were a formidable ally. We could not have defeated the Germans. And comparatively, as much as we want to champion it, we did a tiny, insignificant amount in comparison to what Russia did. You don't hear about it. It's not a normal storyline. So since we knew that we could not go to war against them, we started in 1945 the Cold War that went on and on and on. And America ran on Duncan. We were supercharged because there were copious amounts and millions of pieces of munitions and ordnance and advanced weapon craft that was needed to safeguard us against the Russian bear, although not one time was it ever used. Because to use it meant the death of us all and the death of all of them. We do not want peace. But in the course of that, we developed another enemy, another big lie. We will marginalize these people over time until they become demonic. And then anything we say or do, you will believe. And now Russia is bad. But once again, like Germany in World War II, we not only armed Germany, we not only financed Germany, we went to war against Germany, the Nazis, the Third Reich. Russia is our purported enemy. I'm going to tell you that they are not. But yet we buy their steel, we buy their lumber, we buy their uranium, but we are now engaged in a warfare indirectly against them because directly we cannot win. So until next time on the Comfortable in Chaos podcast, I bid you bon voyage, my burgeoning flock.